In the past 125 years, cinematic special effects have progressed to where nothing, absolutely nothing, is beyond the grasp of our imagination. We can see countless alien worlds and watch them destroyed with the snap of a finger. Surprisingly, it all goes back to the unique vision of one man, Georges Méliès. Far from being superseded, however, Méliès' artistic vision gives his work an undeniable magic and charm that still holds us spellbound over a century later. Born in 1861 as the child of shoemakers, Méliès took an interest in painting and stage magic, eventually becoming the owner of the Théâtre Robert Houdin. When Méliès saw the Lumière brothers' astonishing new cinematograph in 1895, he was himself entranced and would go on to produce over 500 films of his own, beginning with the same simple actualities as the Lumières and quickly moving on to filming his stage magic skits within fantastical painted sets. And from practical stage magic, it wasn't long before Méliès figured out how to work magic with the camera. His genius created cinematic special effects, pioneering techniques like substitution splices, time-lapse photography, miniatures, multiple exposures and superimpositions, and even hand-tinted color in use for generations to follow. Despite all his innovations in special effects, some of the most rudimentary elements of cinema escaped him, like the close-up, or even just moving the camera. Méliès never surpassed the staginess of cinema's beginning, where movies were shot by simply bolting the camera to the floor and filming a theatrical play. This ultimately led to his being bypassed by American and German filmmakers. But notwithstanding, this curious artifact lends Méliès' films an intriguing contradiction. In one sense, we are kept far from the subject, standing apart as objective observers, unable to see into the eyes and hearts of the actors pantomiming broadly in front of us in a very antiquated style. But in another, we are free to enter Méliès' world in a way that we cannot with most filmmakers who followed. Our eyes are free to wander across his magnificent shadowbox phantasmagoria of Trompe l'œil, to be absorbed by and transported into his hyperrealist world through our own exploration, rather than being directed to look at only what he wants us to look at. And one needs to look everywhere, because one never knows from whence the next sprite or spirit or papier-mâché monster might spring. This is what preserves the beauty and meaning of Méliès' films. Though crude and antiquated, which might otherwise have relegated them to mere historical interest, like so many of his contemporaries, his films are imbued with a distinctive romantic aesthetic that continues to entrance. Méliès very much saw himself as an heir to French art and history, as the first great French artist in the new medium of film, which through the Lumières was itself a French invention. The overwhelming majority of Méliès' films were short subjects, 2 or 4 minutes long, showcasing stage and special effects trickery, but his first experiment in long-form filmmaking was his multi-part epic on the Dreyfus Affair. Alfred Dreyfus was an Alsatian Jewish officer of the French military, convicted of giving secrets to the Germans in 1894. 2 years after Dreyfus was sentenced to Devil's Island in French Guiana, new evidence surfaced implicating a French army major. This evidence was suppressed, and false evidence fabricated to maintain Dreyfus's conviction. The case became a touchstone in social and religious controversy in fin de siècle France, sharply dividing the country when the case was reopened in 1899, the same year that Méliès released his sympathetic cinematic exposé. Later long-form subjects would draw from a multiplicity of French inspirations. After the Dreyfus Affair came his 1900 retelling of Joan of Arc. In the wake of the Industrial Revolution and the massive changes it brought to the communities and ways of life of Europe, there was a resurgence of interest in those traditions that were lost. It began with the Romantics of the 18th century and flowered with Gothic revivalism in the 19th. As a patriotic Frenchman of the Belle Époque, Méliès would have been tapped into the renewed fascination with Joan of Arc. Since her life, conquests, and tragic death, she became an amorphous symbol of French identity, ready to be used by anyone for any reason who have a stake in French society. A sign of strength and divine providence, she was appropriated by republicans for her humble origins, and by monarchists for her support of the crown. Just as she was a rallying point for France during the Lancasterian phase of the Hundred Years' War between 1415 and 1453, so too was she in the wake of the disastrous Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 71. Against growing industrialization, she was a symbol of the medieval, and against growing secularization, she was a symbol of Catholicism. In 1909, she was beatified on the steps of the Cathédrale Notre-Dame de Paris, and in 1920 the Maid of Orleans was officially canonized as Saint Joan of Arc, patron saint of France, as well as martyrs, captives, people ridiculed for their piety, military personnel, and the U.S. Women's Army Corps. Even those with no particular ties to France venerate the saint, and many women look to her as an icon of female heroism. The nature of Joan's story, replete with angelic visitations and heavenly voices, lends itself well to Méliès' heady trick photography and sumptuous romantic medievalism that makes no distinction between the forces of political history and the gilded land of fairy tales. Thus next among his influences were the great weavers of French contes de fées, and particularly among them Charles Perrault. Méliès adapted Cinderella twice, as one of his first films in 1899 and one of his last in 1912. He also adapted Bluebeard in 1901, and in 1906 produced The Fairy Carabosse, referencing Perrault's Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. But his greatest pure fairy tale film was The Kingdom of the Fairies in 1903. France already had a strong tradition of fairy plays, or féeries, from which Méliès could divine inspiration. These were theatrical plays popular through the 19th century, making strong use of set design and practical effects, smoke bombs, trapdoors, and the like, to adorn music, dance, pantomime, and acrobatics, a genre perfectly suited to Méliès. The Kingdom of the Fairies is perhaps our most extensive cinematic record of the féeries. Its plot is liberally of the archetype in Perrault's Sleeping Beauty and Marie-Catherine d'Aulnoy's The Doe in the Woods, itself adapted into a féerie by the brothers Guignard in 1845. A prince, played by Méliès, is to be wed, but a spurned witch comes to abduct the princess. The prince leads the rescue party, which is tossed about and sunk in stormy seas. They are rescued by the spirits of the deeps and conveyed through Poseidon's grottos to the castle, where his fair maiden is held captive, and a daring rescue follows. Everything in Kingdom of the Fairies is opulent and luxuriant, from the ornate rococo of the surface to the grotesque of the undersea realm. Grotesque in the more classical meaning of the term, not merely as the ugly, but as the mysterious and sublime, exemplified in caverns, caves, and mossy grottos. The word itself, grotesque, derives from grotto. Through the 19th century, the grotesque was applied to such constructs as King Ludwig II's Wagnerian retreats and the themed aquaria of the 1867 Paris Exposition Universelle. Here we see it in Méliès' Trompe d'Oeil, those flat-painted sets with their illusion of depth, imbuing a magical charm of artificiality and hyperrealism all their own. This paper moon world was inspired from the engravings produced by artists like Edouard Rieu for Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Which brings us to the author with whom Georges Méliès has had no greater lasting association, Jules Verne, and his scientific romances. Greatest among these is the film which best enshrined Méliès to posterity, 1902's A Trip to the Moon. It is one of the most iconic images of cinema history, the man in the moon being hit in the eye by a steel and rivet rocket capsule. It captures at the same time everything quaint and fantastical about silent film and scientific romances. Though lasting a mere 14 minutes, A Trip to the Moon transports viewers to an amazing alternate world where shimmering stars are beautiful women, the astronomer and the astrologer are entwined, and all that is needed to reach the moon is a healthy dose of magic and a very large gun. From the outset, one would be forgiven for thinking that a trip to the moon takes place in the late 1500s rather than the early 1900s. As in numerous Méliès films, the academics of the piece are dressed up in cloaks more worthy of the sorcerer's lair than the scientist's laboratory. There is a marriage in A Trip to the Moon between the rich mythological sphere of the astrologer and the modern mechanical world of the astronomer, through which fantasy intermingles with science. In this sense, Méliès is more of the pure romantic than is Verne. Jules Verne rose to popular literary stardom with a distinctive artistic vision of his own, that the solitary romantic genius could be a man of science, and that modern science could be the means to transcendental appreciation of space, time, nature, and divinity. The romantic tradition in which Verne found himself rose as a critique of modernity and the failed promises of its political and industrial revolutions. The Enlightenment quickly turned into a dark age of atomization, secularization, nihilism, colonialism, political violence, unprecedented industrial warfare, the destruction of nature, exploitation of the working classes, and the alienation of man from himself, his world, his history, and his creator. The Romantic response was to retreat from the caustic glare of the Enlightenment into the Gothic, Orientalist, Arabesque, religious and nationalistic, that is, into history and the exotic. A search for meaning in tradition, ritual, creativity, nature, the divine, the alien, the original, and folk identity. Napoleon may have been a product of modernity, but his conquest of Egypt brought with it an army of artists and scientists that created a fever for the exotic that only deepened with French conquests of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, a passion reflected in Georges Méliès' films like The Terrible Turkish Executioner, The Monster, The Genie of Fire, and most of all, 1905's The Palace of the Arabian Nights, based on the 1001 Arabian Nights, which itself entered French culture in 1704 through the translations of Antoine Galland, a French archaeologist and scholar of the Middle East. Romanticism also embraced the senses, beauty, emotion, intuition, love, unfettered creative freedom, untamed nature, the sublime, and the deep, roiling subconscious forces subordinated by the dark age of reason, even when they flirted with dark, chaotic, chthonic urges. This was especially appealing to Méliès as a stage magician, who peddled in the imaginary made real and the real made hidden. His favorite character to depict was Satan himself, and the Gothic was his favorite setting to put him in. Méliès even adapted that romantic urtext, Faust, multiple times, including a variation in The Merry Frolics of Satan, in which the devil masquerades as a sorcerer to entrap the hapless scientist, Professor Crackford, with a demonic carriage ride through the celestial spheres and into the Inferno. Jules Verne's innovation was to marry reason and romanticism, to understand that science and technology could themselves be the means to these deeper transcendental values. His intention was to infuse books like From the Earth to the Moon, upon which A Trip to the Moon is partly based, with beauty and wonder and all that is romantic in life. He also stated his intention, however, to be as scientifically accurate as possible, given the knowledge at the time. And the book itself is a biting satire of American society, as keenly observant of human foibles as of scientific progress. This, in turn, was inherited and amplified by Méliès' genius. Under the glassy eye of Méliès' camera, the cosmos of the astronomer and the astrologer are merged. The chemist reverts to the alchemist. The heavenly bodies become gossamer-clad women once more, and the man in the moon is hit square in the eye with an iron rivet capsule. For the pride of France, including a military salute and a chorus of flag-bearing Rubenesque beauties to see them off, the voyagers are shot to the moon from a giant cannon. Upon landing, they enter the part of the film based very loosely on H.G. Wells' 1901 novel, The First Men in the Moon, and more so on Jacques Offenbach's 1875 Féerie operetta Le Voyage dans la Lune, with its potent application of contes de fées to Verne's 1865 story. Thus is the English author dealt a harsher blow than is Verne. Verne, Offenbach, and Méliès all share a sense of satirical humor and very French joie de vivre. Unfortunately for Wells, but to the great delight of viewers, his straight delivery of his mean-spirited critique of humankind is reincarnated in A Trip to the Moon as vaudeville tumbling slapstick in a sublunar fairy kingdom. Discovering the power of gravity, the Voyagers escape the lunar Selenites by literally pounding them into dust, and throw any last lingering remnant of realism completely out the window by pushing their capsule off the edge of the moon. Once more, fantasy and science collide as the antiquated concept of the flat world is brought out as a surprising deus ex machina. How do you get a group of explorers shot from a gun back to the Earth? By recalling the magical, alchemical world of the astrologer, and having them jump off the edge of the moon to fall back to Earth through the ethereal vapors. A Trip to the Moon was Méliès' most popular film to that point, and catapulted him into international stardom, despite not being able to reap that stardom's financial rewards thanks to loose copyright enforcement. So naturally, he would follow it up with a number of films on similar themes. 1904's The Impossible Voyage doubles the length and sends his explorers on an extended journey across the world and into the sun, but sadly did not explore any really new thematic ground. It's just more. Charming, but a nonetheless uninspired repetition. Similar images, but more original ideas, surface in 1906 Inventor Crazy Brains and His Wonderful Airship, and 1907's The Eclipse, or The Courtship of the Sun and the Moon. The former features the inventor of an airship who becomes feverish when his waking dream turns into an evening nightmare. In the latter, the astronomer-astrologer returns to spy a lascivious heavenly moment between the sun and the moon, followed by shooting stars as gossamer-clad women. This sends him, much like Inventor Crazy Brains, into paroxysms. These great sights of transcendental beauty are too much for the human mind to process. Unfortunately, Méliès began winding down production in the early 1910s, just as his art reached its peak. Méliès took the staged, tableau style about as far as it could go artistically before the American movie factory and new innovations in filmmaking by directors from Hollywood and the German schools irrevocably changed the very fabric of the medium. To see this, one merely has to compare his first and last versions of Cinderella, in 1899 and 1912, respectively. Though Méliès' craftsmanship and scale improve through the 13 years that separate the two films, his technique does not. They are fundamentally, stylistically, the same film, the latter just longer and more elaborate. Cinderella was just one of 4 films Méliès produced in 1912, the last year in which he made films. He also produced another fairy tale, The Night of the Snows, a comedy in The Voyage of the Bourrachon Family, and a final scientific romance in The Conquest of the Pole, which is very much the height of his artistic prowess. Conquest of the Pole follows the outline of A Trip to the Moon and The Impossible Voyage, but with a much faster and more satisfying pace. It opens with a great professor's proposition to explore some fantastic and far-flung realm, followed by a visit to the factory where the transportation is being manufactured, and much frenzy before and during takeoff. Yet it also shows us how the world caught up to Méliès' fantastic world of magic and romance. Time marched onwards, and the means of travel have changed considerably. In the wake of Henry Ford and the Wright brothers, no longer were 1902's rocket capsules and steam trains acceptable. It was 1912, the age of aeroplanes and automobiles. For Conquest of the Pole, Méliès may have found some inspiration in Jules Verne's 2-volume tale of Captain Hatteras' quest for the pole, a perennial English hobby in the mid-19th century. But there was plenty to draw from in his own time. The North Pole was finally reached by land in either 1908 or 1909, depending on whose claim you believe. Roald Amundsen was the first to reach the South Pole in 1911. In 1908, just as explorers reached the North Pole, the Great Automobile Race from New York to Paris was staged. Méliès had even lampooned automobile travel as early as his 1905 film Paris to Monte Carlo in 2 hours. Aeroplane racing had begun in earnest in France in 1909 and worked its way into the United States in 1910 and the UK in 1911, culminating in the 1911 Circuit of Europe race. Much like Jules Verne before him, circumnavigation of the globe and investigation of its farthest flung points were within reach, and Méliès' work became outdated, both in terms of content and execution. Yet for Méliès, in one last glorious moment, an airplane could still be a vehicle into wonder. Just as he could blend together the worlds of the astronomer and the astrologer in previous films, here he can merge magic and engineering. In one of his last films, Méliès could not resist revisiting his beloved paper moons, painted vistas, and fantastic beasts, culminating in the massive snow giant that was no camera trick. It was indeed a gargantuan marionette. As magnificent an adventure as Conquest of the Pole was, it was not a commercial success. In 1910, Méliès had made a distribution deal with Pathé that gave the studio the right to edit his films, which they chose not to exercise so long as they were successful. The deal also included significant cash from Pathé in exchange for the deeds to Méliès' home and studio. When Conquest of the Pole underperformed, Pathé exercised their option to edit his films. Ironically, this made his final films in 1912 perform even more poorly, and Méliès broke the contract. The Great War prevented Pathé from collecting on his debt, but when they finally could in 1923, Méliès committed the very French act of destroying his negatives and burning his sets. At that point, it may have been little matter, though. Financial mismanagement, inability to compete with new distribution systems, and changes in public taste around and after World War I left Méliès' romantic ideals behind. He descended into a mediocre life as a street vendor until he was rediscovered in the late 1920s, granted the Legion of Honor in 1931, became the first conservator of what would become the Cinémathèque Française in 1936, and was preparing a return to filmmaking by the time of his death in 1938. In a sense, all film is heir to Georges Méliès, simply by virtue of the practical and special effects techniques he essentially invented. No genre was untouched by Méliès, from drama and biography and musical, to the first known examples of science fiction, horror, and fantasy films. Nevertheless, few have been able to mirror his brilliant imagination and feverish output. There are those who have tried, whose own style very much bear the influence of the great master. There's the Czech auteur Karel Zeman, French animator Paul Gramont, Jean-Pierre Jeunet, Terry Gilliam, Baz Luhrmann, all brilliant filmmakers in their own rights. But in truth, we must all kneel before the pioneer whose undeniable spirit of magic, wonder, and romance still captures our imaginations like none other today.